Wow, I'm overwhelmed by the crowd. Good morning, and thank you for this invitation. Let me introduce myself. I'm Stefania Maurizi. I'm an investigative journalist working for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. And here we are lucky to have Pulitzer Prize winner James Risen, who worked for the New York Times, 20 years for the New York Times, and last year he left the New York Times and joined the Intercept, the online newspaper founded by Glenn Greenwald. And we have Estelle Dehaene, a lawyer from Cornerstone Barristers, based in London. And we have Jennifer Robinson, a lawyer for Doughty Street Chambers in London. So we have a very important story by James Risen, who spent the last 7 years fighting the US government because he's a decent journalist. He's not only a great journalist, but a decent person who wanted to fight for his source and who didn't want to give up, didn't want to testify to implicate his source. And he will tell us his story. He will tell us what it means when you have the full force of the government against you and your source. But let me explain why I put together these three speakers. Put together these three speakers who have different background. So I think you realize that in our democracies, you have different level of powers. You have the most obvious powers, the local politicians who basically are in charge of making sure that schools work, streets are fine, and so on. You have national politicians we blame for all sorts of things, and they approve laws which have an impact on our jobs, our health, our education. But there is a less obvious level, an invisible level of power. It is an invisible power, and the invisible level is where the intelligence agencies operate. Most of us don't even care about the intelligence agency. We live ordinary lives. We don't think they have our lives ever cross with the intelligence agency. Why I should care about intelligence agency? I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, I'm an employee who have an ordinary life. Why I should care about intelligence agencies? But as a matter of fact, these people have real power on our lives. And James Risen will explain you what kind of real power. He knows this work. He knows the dark corners of this invisible world. So the story is what happened when you have this invisible power against you? What happened when you have this full force of the state against you? Because you mess up as a journalist with this word, you reveal something very explosive, a bombshell about this invisible world, or because, as Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden did, by revealing the inner secrets of this world. What happened when you have these forces against you, when you have the full force of the state against you? So we want to discuss this invisible power because the real power is invisible, and most people don't even perceive it, don't even realize that this power has an influence on their lives. So let me ask James Risen to discuss these dark corners.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This is a great honor to be here in Perugia. It's my first time here, and it's an amazing conference, so thank you very much. I thought I would talk primarily about my own life experience as a reporter covering national security starting in the 1990s in Washington, because it provides a good background for the larger discussion that I think we're going to be having about some of the problems journalists have today in dealing with things like FOIA and as Stefania said, you know, the secret side of the government when they are resisting journalistic efforts to hold government agencies accountable. And it is a very strange experience to begin to see what that dark side of the government is like up close and personal. That many of you, I'm sure, have had some experience with in different countries. I think that will lead into our discussion, hopefully, as a panel later. So I thought I would just start by explaining a little bit of my background. I've been a reporter for almost 40 years. I started as right out of college, basically, and journalism school, working as a reporter at a small newspaper in Indiana, in the United States. For any of you who have been to the United States and you've been to Indiana, good luck. Thank you very much. Anyway, I finally started covering the CIA. I was covering business and economics for many years for a number of newspapers. I covered the auto industry in Detroit, and then I covered the Federal Reserve in Washington. So I covered a lot of different things, and I got kind of bored with that. And in 1995, I was at the Los Angeles Times in Washington, and I was covering economics, and I went to my editors and said I'd like to cover something else. And they ignored me, as editors usually do. And I had to ask several times. And I always wondered whether they wanted me to keep covering economics because they thought I was good at it, or they thought I was not good enough to do anything else. And I still don't know the answer to that. Finally, they said to me, after I pestered them for quite a while, they said, well, we have this one job that nobody else wants. It would be covering Latin American policy half-time at the State Department and covering the CIA half-time. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And it kind of shows you what the intelligence beat was like in the mid-1990s. It was an afterthought. It was half a job. And I took the job, and I never wrote about Latin American policy at the State Department. And the editors only asked me once or twice to do Latin American stories, and I just ignored them and just started covering the CIA full-time, which nobody had been doing at the Los Angeles Times for a while, which shows you how different things are today. And what I realized pretty soon, and this was 1995, and it was the Cold War had ended, and Aldrich Ames, who was a Russian mole inside the CIA, had just been found unmasked and arrested the year before. And a lot of people, because of the drawdown in the budget at the end of the Cold War under the Clinton administration, and because of the repercussions from the Ames case, where a lot of senior people were reprimanded or investigated for their role in allowing Ames to last so long at the CIA, a lot of people there was a huge exodus of people from the CIA at that time. So it was a perfect time to start covering the CIA. And a lot of the senior people who were leaving were mad at the reporters who had covered the Ames case, which I had missed because I came in a year later. And so they were looking for somebody new to talk to. And so I was the beneficiary of this mass exodus from the CIA. And at that time, it's hard to realize today, at that time there was virtually no leak investigations of any journalism in Washington. The leak investigations that did take place were very cursory, and the reporters were never told about them, were never pressed to talk about their sources, and they all died. The investigations were closed and died, and I don't think anybody was ever arrested during that time period. And so it was a much different climate, and so I began to realize there were all these people who had left who were willing to start talking about their experiences for the first time in their lives, because they all felt like, they were leaving, the Cold War was over, the CIA had basically won the Cold War, that's their view anyway, and they wanted to tell their stories. And there was virtually no punishment and they weren't supposed to talk, obviously. There were legal strictures on their ability to talk, but it was a much freer atmosphere. And so over the next several years, I developed, because there were very few reporters actually covering the CIA at that time. There was a handful of people. There was me at the Los Angeles Times, or the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and that was about it. There may have been one or two other people. I think CNN at that time had somebody, but it was a tiny handful of people who were actually covering the CIA. And so it was a fantastic environment as a reporter to develop a network of sources. And so by the time 9/11 happened, I was in a great position to try to cover that. I covered the 1998 embassy bombings in Africa, and so I had already begun covering Al-Qaeda before 9/11. And and so then after 9/11, I began writing, mostly about terrorism. And so I had this head start based on having covered the agency for 6 years by that point, and having a number of sources that other people who were just starting to try to catch up right after 9/11 didn't have. And so, but what happened really was that everything began to change culturally for a reporter in Washington covering national security after 9/11. There had always been, while there was no investigations of journalists or their sources to any great degree before, during the 90s and before 9/11, there were efforts by the government to try to stop you from writing certain stories. Before 9/11, for instance, I found out about this effort by the CIA to work send case officers to Afghanistan to work with Massoud and the Northern Alliance to go after bin Laden. And the CIA director called me personally and asked me not to run that story. He said, "You'll get my guys killed." And this was in about the year 2000, so it was about a year and a half before 9/11. And I agreed. I said, okay, I won't write that story. And looking back, right after 9/11, I finally wrote that story right after 9/11. But looking back, that decision not to run that story haunted me for a long time, because I realized after 9/11, a lot of the investigations into 9/11 found that the CIA had only made a half-hearted effort to go after bin Laden, and that the operation I had heard about was part of that very token effort by the CIA. And I realized that if I had written that story before 9/11, the CIA definitely would have been mad at me, but it might have sparked a debate, a public debate in Washington about whether the United States was doing enough to get bin Laden. And so I began to realize that these efforts by the government to ask you not to write stories were generally designed to protect people politically, and were not really efforts to protect the national security of the United States, which was what their argument always was. And so that incident, that episode, really began to get me to think differently after 9/11 about efforts by the government to get you not to write stories. And so that my mindset changed based largely on that experience with that story. And it really set me on a collision course with the New York Times editors and with the government over their willingness to kill stories based on the idea that the stories would harm national security. And that's what happened a lot more after 9/11. The Bush administration began to use 9/11 as a justification to begin to make much more frequent efforts than it had ever been before to kill stories and to pressure news organizations not to write about what the United States was doing in the war on terror, what kind of secret operations and programs that were being done in this, what we began to call the GWAT, the global war on terror. And one of the first stories after 9/11 that the White House asked us not to run was a story in 2002 we had about a secret CIA prison in Thailand when it was the first CIA secret prison. And we found out about it, and I was the one who called the CIA for comment. And the White House called the editors and got the story killed. And I realized then that that was really just purely because of the political embarrassment of the idea that we had secret prisons. Clearly, the Al-Qaeda prisoners in those secret prisons knew about those secret prisons. So that was really my first experience after 9/11 with this effort, the accelerating and intensifying effort after 9/11 to begin to kill stories. But that continued very regularly and more intensely by the Bush administration. And it culminated, the next major story I had that led to a real showdown with the government was in 2003, early 2003, just as the war in Iraq was beginning. I found out about an operation, a CIA operation, which was a real stupid operation, to provide nuclear blueprints to Iran. And it was a poorly thought out and mismanaged operation. And the White House, when I called the CIA for comment about it, Condoleezza Rice, who was the national security advisor, immediately called my boss, the Washington bureau chief at the New York Times. And we went to called us into the White House, and we went to Condoleezza Rice's office, which is right next to the Oval Office in the West Wing. And it was one of the most bizarre experiences I've had in my life, because sitting in this office. It was me and the bureau chief, and Condoleezza Rice, the national security advisor, and George Tenet, the CIA director. And Rice stared at me, very like penetratingly stared, and said, I want you to destroy your notes, never make another phone call about this, and spike this story, and never talk to anyone ever again about this. And I said, whoa. Yeah. And I was able to get Tenet to talk a little bit about the story, and he actually basically confirmed the story while we were sitting there. And, but it was a very intimidating conversation. And the bureau chief and I left, and you know, I thought, this is very intimidating, but at the same time, it was great confirmation. It was a better confirmation for the story than I've ever had in my life. And so that led to a very long debate inside the New York Times between me and my editors about whether we should run the story. And it happened. Ironically enough, our meeting with Rice happened almost the same time as the Jason Blair scandal was erupting, like a few days later. And so the editors were very distracted, naturally, by that. And then over the next few months and over the next year, I tried to get the editors to run the story, and Bill Keller, who was then became the executive editor, ultimately decided not to run it. And this happened at about the same time, or right after, I had been trying to fight to get some stories into the paper that were skeptical of the intelligence on the war in Iraq prior to the war. I had been trying to get the paper to run some stories saying that there were intelligence analysts who were skeptical of the pre-war intelligence. And those stories had been cut or buried at the same time that the paper was writing big stories about the existence of weapons of mass destruction. And so I was very frustrated at the paper, both because they were killing my stories and they were running these big WMD stories. And so I began to think about putting everything I knew into a book. Then the next year, 2004, I was meeting with a source, in the midst of a conversation, this source told me, you know, is it like at the tail end of a long meeting, if you're a reporter and you know what a source meeting is like, usually you cover a lot of different things with a source and talk. And this source just looked at me and said, you know, I know what I think is the biggest secret in the government, but I can't tell you what it is. And which is like the weirdest conversation to have with a reporter. And I decided, well, I should meet this person again. And so over the next few months, I met with this source several times, and at the end of every meeting, I would say, well, can you tell me what that thing is? And the source would say, no, I'm too scared. Because by that time, leak investigations were starting to get more intense. The Valerie Plame case, if any of you remember that, really changed the culture on leak investigations in the United States. It was a very convoluted case. If any of you want to Google Valerie Plame, it might help. But it was a case in which in 2003, 2004 time period, 2004, 2005, where Valerie Plame was a covert CIA officer whose husband was a very public critic of the war in Iraq. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times criticizing the war in Iraq. And someone in the government weirdly thought that by identifying the fact that his wife was a CIA officer would somehow hurt him. And so there was an investigation of who leaked Valerie Plame's identity. And it became this proxy fight, political fight in Washington over the war in Iraq. And a lot of reporters got subpoenaed to testify about whether they're not, who told them from the Bush White House about Valerie Plame. In any event, the Valerie Plame case led to a breakdown in the old culture in Washington that the government would never really do aggressive leak investigations. And that was happening at the same time I was meeting this source. And so sources were beginning to get more nervous about talking. And so in 2004, over a number of meetings I began to have with this source, we began to just, in shorthand, talk about this thing that this source wouldn't tell me what it was as the biggest secret. And at the end of every meeting, I would say, "Can you tell me what the biggest secret is?" And this person would say no. And finally, I had another meeting with this source, and as I was leaving, I just turned to the source and said, "You've got to tell me now." And to my surprise, everything came out all at once. And it was about the NSA's domestic spying program and about the fact that the NSA had begun spying on Americans without court orders or warrants in a massive spying program that was illegal and that almost no one in the government knew about and had not been approved by Congress, by the courts, by anybody. And I realized this was a massive story, the story of a lifetime. And I was able to confirm the story with other sources, and then I found that a reporter who sat right next to me in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times had also been hearing similar things. And so we began to work together. And by the October of 2004, we had a story ready to go. And I think it was late September, early October, or actually, yeah, it was late September, I think. We had a story, we were starting to get a draft of a story, and I decided I was just going to go through what reporters would call going through the front door, and go to the press office of the National Security Agency, which, believe it or not, has a press office. And I told the woman there, I said, "You've got to put me on the phone with the director right now." And I wouldn't tell her why. And I was just bluffing. I figured she wouldn't do it. And I said, "It's absolutely urgent. I speak to the director of the NSA right now." And to my shock, she put him on the phone. And then I had to figure out what I was going to ask him. And luckily I was sitting at my computer in my office, and I just started reading him the top of the draft of the story we had, which described the NSA's domestic spying program. And after I'd read a couple graphs, I just heard on the phone, and then it was Mike Hayden, who was then the director of the NSA. And then he said, "Well, whatever we're doing is operationally effective and legal." And at that moment, I realized I had him. He had just basically confirmed the story. And then I started trying to ask him more questions, and he hung up because he realized he'd said too much. And I went to the bureau chief. It was a new bureau chief, and I told him what we had. And Eric Lischblau had been sitting like as close as we are. During my phone conversation, he was staring at me. It was a very, very cinematic moment. And but shortly thereafter, Hayden called the New York Times editors and wanted to kill the story. And that led to a meeting between the bureau chief, me, and the acting CIA director, who was a man named John McLaughlin, and his deputy, his chief of staff, John Mosman, and we met them at the old executive office building across the street from the White House, where the CIA director has an office. And it was this very strange conversation where they wouldn't confirm the story. They kept talking in hypotheticals, kept saying, if the United States had such a program, it would be very bad for a newspaper to write about it. And if we had such a program, it would be the crown jewel of whatever anti-terrorism programs we're conducting. But I can't confirm that we actually have such a program. And by this time, I'd been through this routine with the White House and with the Bush administration several times, and I started taking notes. And they said, "You can't take notes." And I just continued to take notes. That was the first meeting in what became more than a year of negotiations between the New York Times and the Bush administration over our NSA story. It was a very long and tortured process. The paper decided right before the 2004 presidential election to kill the story in a meeting we had in New York. And then after the election, Eric Lischblau and I got the paper to agree to let us try again to get the story in the paper, and we did more reporting and rewriting and editing, and in December 2004, they killed it again. And the story was pretty much dead then, and I decided to put that story and the Iran story in a book. And the next fall, when I had finished writing the book, and it had been basically edited, I guess it was late summer of 2005, I told the editors, the NSA story and the Iran story are going to be in my book, you should publish them. And that did not go over well with my editors. They had this long fight over the next few months about what we were going to do, whether they were going to run the stories, and they began new negotiations with the Bush administration over whether to publish the NSA story. And Eric and I kept trying to get more people to talk. Finally, they published the story about 2 weeks before my book came out. And I think, in hindsight, that whole experience changed the culture at the New York Times about their willingness to go along with the government's efforts to kill stories. Because after that, since then, since the experience on the NSA story, the New York Times has been much more willing and more aggressive in being willing to publish stories that the government doesn't want. And that leads me to where we are today. I think one of the first big things that happened after that was WikiLeaks in 2011, 2010. And then the Snowden archives in 2013. And the paper was much more aggressive than they had been before. You could argue, and I think we will, argue with the way they handled those things. But that leads us into this conversation of how those things have been handled by the press. So,
yes, I want to argue about this because when it comes to this level of power, the invisible level of power, the real power is soft, is invisible, but is the real power. Based on my experience, but I think your experience is still more relevant, is that the newspapers, the editors, always accept what the government tell them. And I have seen what happened with WikiLeaks, how dishonest was, how completely indecent was the behavior of Bill Keller, the New York Times, and other big newspapers, and how they treated the sources like Chelsea Manning, how they treated Julian Assange, how they treated WikiLeaks, just because they wanted the material, they wanted the scoops, but at the same time they wanted to destroy, they wanted to put in a bad light these people because they realized the conflict they were opening with the government, with the US government. So they wanted to have this good relationship with the government, and they wanted to keep getting information and scoops from the government, but at the same time, they needed to destroy them. They needed to destroy their reputation. They needed to put them in a very bad, ambiguous light. This is what I have witnessed in 9 years of my work as a media partner of WikiLeaks. This is what I have witnessed with Chelsea Manning, with Edward Snowden. And at the end of the day, when working on these cases, I realized how bad the coverage was. I mean, I realized, for example, that for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, there was not a single journalist who had tried to access the actual document of the case. Can you imagine hundreds of news organizations covering this case, and no one had ever tried to get access to the documents of the case, to get factual information? For me, it is incredible. That's why I decided to go to the court and litigate the case when the UK government denied me the documents, and we finally litigate in court before a tribunal with Estelle and Jennifer, because no media organization had ever tried to get access to the documents and say, let's see what happened. So my experience when it comes to this as a journalist, when it comes to this level of power, is that newspapers are really bad, editors are really bad, and they don't believe these government people are liars. They lie to us to save their ass, to save their reputation, to avoid embarrassment. And you don't see the newspapers still side with the government. Right. Even if the culture has changed, they still side with the government. Do you agree with this?
It depends. I mean, I think as I said, I think the New York Times changed to some degree after the NSA story. They became more willing to write about leaks of classified information than I think they had been before. And you're right, there was certainly a lot of times where they are willing to take what the government says at face value. I know in my case, on the NSA story, one of the problems we had was the editors met with government officials without me or Eric Lischblau at the meetings. And in at least one case, we know that the government officials were telling them something that was basically a lie about the program, the NSA program, in order to convince the editors that we were hyping the story. And it took, after Eric and I realized that's what they were hearing, it took us quite a while to convince the editors that the government was lying to them. And after that, I think that helped convince the editors finally to print our story once we were able to convince them that they were being lied to in these private sessions they were having with the government without us. And so I think you're right, there has traditionally been an institutional willingness in the major media to accept what the government says. I think that's broken down today in Washington with Trump in particular, but there's still a latent sense of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, as I said, in the WikiLeaks story, I was shocked to realize how thousands of reporters were covering the case, and no one tried to get access to the document to discover what happened. So you had all these thousands of press reports saying he tried to escape from justice. And no one had tried to access the actual document from the Swedish prosecutors, from the UK prosecutors, and check, let me see what really happened, what the prosecutors were writing, what the Assange lawyers were writing, what the UK government was writing. No one tried to get hard facts, which is the first thing that a reporter is supposed to do. I mean, that's why I decided to go to litigate the case, to ask for the documents to the government, the UK government and the Swedish government. And when they say, no, you don't have the right to access these documents, you don't have the right to get copies of these documents because these documents damage international relations. And that's why I decided to litigate the case, to go to court with lawyers, Estelle and Jan, and to try to say, I think the press has the right to see the full set of documents, to understand what happened, because here we have an editor who is arbitrarily detained in the embassy in London, in the Ecuadorian embassy. I'm not saying this. It's not my opinion. My opinion is completely irrelevant. It is what the United Nations established. The United Nations is a body in charge of establishing who is arbitrarily detained, established that Mr. Assange is detained since 2010. And so I want to see what happened. Something went wrong. Something went wrong, and I want to discover what went wrong. So I need the documents, and you have to give me the documents. That's why we opened this case, this court case, and now Estelle Dehaene, who is representing me together with Jennifer, will tell you the story behind this case.
Thank you very much, Stefania. So maybe by way of preface, I can explain a little bit about how the freedom of information law in the United Kingdom works. It's a piece of legislation that's designed to allow individuals, anybody, no matter why you want a document or why you want information held by a public authority, the legislation is there to facilitate your access to that information. And of course, there are a number of exemptions because we recognize that that type of openness may not necessarily always be in the public interest, and so there are a number of exemptions, and national security is one. But the regime is designed so that you don't just have the government saying, oh, I can't release this document because of national security, or, oh, I can't release this document because it will harm international relations, or, oh, I can't release this document because it will tip somebody off who may be extradited. They can say that, but then that needs to be tested. And that's what the litigation process is about. The litigation process is about testing the response of whatever the public authority is to say, no, we should keep the documents or the information secret. The other thing that the regime is designed to do is to try and move all public authorities from a position of secrecy to a position of openness, even those agencies who are used to operating in the shadows, like the intelligence services. Even they are subject to this regime. They don't get a blanket exemption. So in Stefania's case, she made a request to the Crown Prosecution Service for correspondence concerning Julian Assange. Correspondence with the Swedish Prosecution Authority to find out about what happened when they asked for extradition of Mr. Assange. Any correspondence between the Crown Prosecution Service and the state of Ecuador to find out if they had any discussions once Mr. Assange went into the embassy. And correspondence between the Crown Prosecution Service and the US State Department and the US Department of Justice, because as we all know, everything that sits behind the situation that Mr. Assange finds himself in is the potential for the United States to extradite if he is removed to a third country like Sweden. And the interesting thing about this litigation from my perspective, and why I think it's important for journalists to understand that even if you think in the end the government may not give you the documents or the information that you're after, stuff will come out during the litigation process. And that is what happened in our experience, that even though in the end we didn't get everything, more came out during that process than I had anticipated might be the case.
Such as we discovered that they destroyed documents, and we don't know why they destroyed documents. It's very suspicious. Why did they destroy? The UK authorities destroyed the emails about such a high-profile case, very controversial case, an ongoing case, why these documents were destroyed. And we asked for explanation. What was the official explanation?
That's a good question. So it came out during the course of the litigation that there was a number of holes in the documents that we were given. So we were given some documents, but others we were refused. And in the documents that we were given, we noticed a pattern that there was some things that were never talked about, things that you can't imagine wouldn't be talked about. So there was no correspondence between, for example, the Swedish Prosecution Authority and the Crown Prosecution Service at the time when Julian Assange went into the Ecuadorian embassy. And there was no correspondence between them at the time when the UN body, which Jen is going to talk about in a sec, when they made the determination that there was arbitrary detention. We thought this can't be possible. So we said to the Crown Prosecution Service, where is this? You must have this. And it came back, no, we realize now that even though our policy is not to delete documents, even though this was an ongoing case, unfortunately it seems like many documents have been deleted. And they don't really have a good explanation. It's just because somebody seems to have left, somebody may have made a mistake, and so the documents have been deleted. So there isn't a full set of correspondence. We await, we've, as you can imagine, asked some further questions as a result of that, and we await some further responses.
And we just have the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, unless we find someone who is an insider of this case and comes out with some documents, she leaks us some documents. All we can use is the Freedom of Information Act, which is quite a good tool. I mean, it's a secure, it's safe. It doesn't require the sacrifice of any source, like leaks. Because when a source leaks documents, the source can have trouble, like in the case of Chelsea Manning. But here we have the FOIA, the Freedom of Information, and unfortunately that's all we can do, asking for documents, going to court, and if they say the documents have been destroyed, what can we do? I mean, I expected the British colleagues investigating the case. They didn't, fortunately. Once again, I don't think journalism is doing well in this case. Why no one investigated this case? I mean, if you read some of the documents we obtained, the UK prosecutors say this case is special, and they don't explain why. They don't say why the case is special. What makes the case special? We would like to understand why the case is special. So I would expect other journalists investigating this case. No, this is not happening. Yeah, there is a very thick secrecy around this case. Jen, is my impression correct?
Absolutely, and I think there is a great irony in the fact that we are discussing the case of Julian Assange, the editor of WikiLeaks, who led the transparency movement, who has brought the right to know into common parlance. Yet the irony is that his case lacks transparency and accountability altogether. So this is a case, we are discussing someone who is an editor and a publisher who is arbitrarily detained in the United Kingdom in a Western democracy. I've been representing Julian and WikiLeaks since 2010, so coming up to 8 years. He has been inside the Ecuadorian embassy for almost 6 years in circumstances where he can't go outside, he can't have access to certain medical treatment, and despite Ecuador's request, the UK has refused that. If he was in prison, he would have access to outside. He'd be outside for at least an hour a day. He's being denied that. Now, why is this? Mr. Assange went into the embassy in 2012 and has the protection of Ecuador because of the risk of persecution in the United States. We know there's a grand jury investigation. It's been ongoing since 2010. It's been described by the Australian government as unprecedented in size and scale. Now, for many years, people said, but the US is not going to go for him. But in 2018, no one can credibly deny that risk. We've had, under the Trump administration, the US Attorney General Jeff Sessions say that prosecuting WikiLeaks is a priority. We've had Mike Pompeo, the director of the CIA, describe WikiLeaks as a hostile non-state intelligence agency, and that Julian Assange ought not benefit from constitutional protections under the First Amendment. This is the kind of semantics that we heard post 9/11 to justify what was at that time unthinkable legal and administrative action. That Julian Assange is in the embassy and has asylum is important. He has protection of Ecuador because the risk of what would happen to him in the United States is real. Now, what we've been looking at in terms of trying to get access to the information is how could this situation arise? How could it be that an editor and a publisher would need to seek asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy? Why was it that Sweden dragged that investigation out for years and years on end? What is it about WikiLeaks that makes them so dangerous? What is so dangerous about the truth? I just want to give you one anecdote before we have a conversation about why we think WikiLeaks is in this situation. But in 2010, when I first started representing Julian, they had published the Afghan war logs, they had published the Iraq war logs. And he sat me down and he said, I have 250,000 diplomatic cables and I'm about to publish them. I didn't even register the significance of what he'd said. I couldn't even comprehend how big this story was about to become. And he said to me, this is going to reveal the nature of diplomacy, corruption, human rights abuse, the world over. And he said, with a perspective that in retrospect we can now all see, he said, they will chase me to the ends of the earth, they will make my life hell, and I'm going to do it anyway. And I thought, the kind of principled courage that that decision took. Very soon after that, they cancelled his bank accounts. They cut off WikiLeaks from international donations through Visa and MasterCard. There was an international arrest warrant for him in circumstances where it was completely unnecessary and we were offering his testimony to the Swedish authorities. What is it about WikiLeaks that has created this situation?
And the interesting thing about Stefania's FOIA case is it doesn't matter what perspective you come at the case from, whether you come at it from the very strong perspective that we've heard from Jen, or whether you come at it from the perspective of Julian Assange being some kind of messianic nutcase who is making up his concerns to do with the United States. It literally does not matter what way you approach the case. Stefania's argument, which was a strong argument, is if we see the underlying documents, if we understand what they say, if we understand why the case was treated in the way it was, then we may get some insight into which of the narratives around this particular individual is the correct narrative. And it may well be that it turns out that there's no extradition request from the United States and nobody's ever been asked anything about that. And it would be incredibly valuable if the documents showed that. So that's why there's a significant importance in this type of litigation, no matter what angle you come at it from.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the important things is I'm intrigued, and I think all reporters who have investigated or have known some way the dark corners is what happened when you have the full force of the state against you. What happened? I mean, and I'm shocked to see how these things don't merge and the reporters don't investigate them. This is my impression.
I think the experience of as a reporter, to me, one of the most jarring things that I learned covering the CIA was I began to realize, after I had been doing it for several years, I began to realize that there's this secret subculture that as a national security reporter covering intelligence, you get a glimpse of that other reporters don't. And it's like you're watching, you're seeing, you're opening a door that you didn't know was there.
Yeah.
And you're looking into this dark room and you get glimpses of things. You don't see the whole picture, but you get these glimpses of these very dark things. And then somebody comes and shuts the door. And you say, what was that? And to me, I began to realize that covering intelligence, and if you do it long enough and get deeply into it, it really is like being in the Matrix, where you are seeing this other world that no one else sees. And my experience was very personal in the sense that you would see this as a reporter covering the CIA, and then you would come back to a newsroom with all these other reporters who were covering normal things, and they wouldn't know what the hell you were talking about. And they had no idea about this secret world, and it began to separate you from other journalists. And sometimes they began to think you were a little crazy. And it's a very jarring experience. And it sends you, and you have to always kind of control your own mind and emotions to make sure you don't leap to conclusions about what you're seeing. But it is such a dark experience and so intense that it's difficult to describe for someone who's never done that kind of reporting. And one of the things that really led me into that sense was I had a source who I still to this day don't know who it was. I got a phone call one day from a woman who clearly was somewhere in the US national security apparatus. And she began to tell me things that only an insider would know.
On the phone.
On the phone. And then she hung up. And then a few days later, she called again and started saying this more stuff. And she wouldn't tell me who she was, where she worked, or how she knew these things. But everything she told me, I was able to check out with other sources. And she kept calling me, and finally she said, the reason I'm calling you is because I've read other things you've done and I like them. But she would never give me any identification of any kind. And finally, I was able to convince her of only one thing, which was to call me at a certain time on a certain day of the week, every week. And so for the next few months, at the certain hour on a certain day every week, I would get this call. And this person would start talking about new classified things. And I would be sitting in the newsroom having this conversation while all these other reporters were covering, housing policy or energy policy or, whatever. And I was having this very intimate conversation, highly illegal conversation with someone who I had no idea who it was. And after a few months, this person stopped calling abruptly. I never heard from her again, and I never found out who she was to this day.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of weird matrix-like experience you begin to have in this world. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the point of this invisible power is that people don't perceive, not even your colleagues realize why is this relevant, this mad world, why we should cover this story. I mean, people have many problems, they don't find job, they don't have job, they can't afford education, they can't afford, so why we should cover these weird people, but they have a power on your life. And when you mess up with them, you discover their power. When your life crosses with them, you discover their power.
What I realized is that in the United States, in particular, there was what I don't think you realize as a reporter, is that there are certain parameters to what is acceptable reporting. And most reporters never bump up against those limits. So you don't even realize they're there. But once you get into this weird world, you start to bump up against those limits. And then you get reaction in a way that no one tells you you're going to get that reaction. You just started getting a reaction because you're not on the accepted highway, information highway anymore. You're somehow trying to get off the accepted conventional highway flow of information between the government and the press. And once you get off that, you get punished. And most reporters, they're just driving down that highway and they don't know it. And they never run up against that. And that's what when you realize there is this secret, silent, dark world out there that when you talk about it, people think you're kind of crazy.
But I think that's also what makes WikiLeaks so important, and in many ways, many of the things that happened in your case, Jim, epitomise that. So whether you're talking about the fact that you were prosecuted to try and reveal your source, the fact that editors shut down important public interest stories about surveillance, those are two instances, which is why Julian Assange set up WikiLeaks, which is an anonymous system by which sources can provide information to journalists safely, whereby the journalist doesn't know who the source is, so cannot be prosecuted to identify that source, and provides that additional protection both to sources and to journalists, and a robust publication policy. Why did Chelsea Manning go to WikiLeaks? Because the New York Times would not have published it. And that's what makes WikiLeaks so dangerous, and the pushback is so hard, because it doesn't rely upon cozy relationships with government to obtain information, and sources give them that information because they know it's going to get published.
Right. One of the fascinating things that happened in the litigation that Stefania brought in the United Kingdom, and this was interesting to me because it happened with really no discussion, was that the Crown Prosecution Service, the Information Commissioner, who's also involved, and the tribunal itself, which is the British equivalent of a lower level court, everybody accepted and treated the case as though WikiLeaks was a media organization, and that's recognized in the judgment, and that there was a public interest in the work that WikiLeaks was doing. And as a lawyer that's interested in freedom of information in the United Kingdom, that at least gave me some solace, that there is a general recognition that alternative types of media, like WikiLeaks, where you are publishing source material in that way, is now a recognized form of journalism and counts at least as a media organisation, and I found that fascinating.
And yet, the UK government will not give an assurance to protect Julian Assange from extradition to face prosecution in the United States for publishing. And that's what's been most disappointing for me in terms of the media coverage of WikiLeaks, is the failure of other media organisations to take a firm stand in standing with WikiLeaks, understanding that if WikiLeaks is prosecuted in the United States for receiving and publishing information, then that is a precedent that puts at risk all media organizations, traditional, mainstream, new media, online publishers. Everybody is at risk by this particular precedent. And the way in which it's been wielded, first by the Obama administration and now more worryingly by the Trump administration, an equal problem for free speech that I think we really must focus people's attention on.
Now we want to hear from you. We have 5 minutes, very little time, but we would like to ask whether you have any question. Well, yes.
Hello, thanks very much. My name is Julie Pizzetta. I'm an Australian journalist and academic. James, I'm going to see you later today to talk about some of these issues, but one of the things that concerns me, and I'd like to hear you respond to about these issues, is the digital threat. The fact that you can now stand up in court and refuse to identify your source, but in a culture of mass surveillance and data interception and metadata handover, and the fact that we do digital journalism so prolifically now, it's created a whole new realm of risks. And I wrote a study for UNESCO looking at these themes, which was released last year. Your case was among them, James. So can you just talk a little bit about how those threats have changed and worsened over this period?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that one of the things that's interesting legally that I learned, I felt like I went to law school for 7 years. One of the things that was interesting was the government can get circumstantial evidence from cyber, hacking or intrusion or court warrants of communications between a journalist and an alleged source. The question becomes, and so it's possible for them to get enough, possible in some cases, to get enough circumstantial evidence to get an indictment. But the question then becomes, is the metadata communications between an alleged source and a journalist enough to actually get a conviction? At least in the United States, where there's preponderance of you have to prove things beyond a doubt, a reasonable doubt. In my case, one of the arguments the government continued to use was they actually needed my testimony for that they had gotten metadata and they'd gotten an indictment of an alleged source, but they felt they still needed my testimony. Ultimately, I never testified and they still won a conviction of an alleged source. But I think that's the real question, is metadata enough for them to win convictions, or is it simply enough to conduct very intrusive investigations that then intimidate whistleblowers and convince them to cut plea agreements, things like that. And so that's one of the interesting questions. I'm not sure that we're at the point where metadata is yet enough for the government. I've had a lot of arguments with other journalists about that, about whether or not metadata is really the magic bullet for prosecutors that a lot of journalists think it is. But I'm still thinking about whether or not that's enough.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know whether they know that your alleged source was basically sentenced to 3 years and a half, 3.5 years in prison, and they had no evidence apart the fact that they had communicated. So the metadata, when you call a source, when a source sent an email a text message or a signal or telegram or whatever, that creates metadata, and that metadata links the reporter to the source forever. There's no way to erase that metadata. And that kind of metadata was used against your alleged source.
Right, and I can't talk too much about that case, but I can say that in general, there is I believe that journalists need to work to improve their use of encryption, and me included. But you know, I tend to think that the best solution is personal meetings where you're off the grid is probably the best solution to avoid, you know, leaving electronic trails.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether we have any other questions. It's enough. We have to leave.
There's a guy back there.
This wonderful.
There's a guy back there. There's a guy raising his hand back there.
Just to take that further, my name is Courtney Radge. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists and former colleague of Jim. Had no idea that was happening when we worked together. Do you think it is even possible? You're talking about metadata, but I think we're talking about all types of data, signals data, the digital detritus that we leave with our devices. And you're saying to go off the grid, but I think in a lot of journalism these days, you can't necessarily meet the source in person. If you're covering Syria, if you're using citizen journalists, for example. Do you think that journalists can even make the guarantee to their sources these days that they can keep them secure? Because it's not like they even need to hack into anything, but your phone is leaving digital trails, they're pinging off of cell towers, you've got stingrays. Right. Can we even say that journalism can protect their sources anymore?
That's a really difficult question, and I think every reporter is asking themselves that now. And the danger is that you can become paralyzed as a reporter by those questions. You can't look into the future and say what the government is going to do in each case. I think the best thing to do is just try to be as careful as possible. But there's also the danger of letting the fear of government investigations hamper or paralyze us into not being as aggressive journalists as we should be. So it's a very difficult balancing act. There's no easy answer, except I think journalists have to continue to try to report on these things, try to be as careful as possible, but there's always going to be some element of risk, and that's the messy truth, I think.
And try to be skeptical about government and believe that the government almost always lies to you to protect itself. And try to get factual information through whatever tools we have, like freedom of information. If the government can tell a reporter, you will never ever get these documents, and nothing happened, and the newspaper doesn't sue the government, the journalist doesn't go to court, well, the government understands that it's fine. It's fine to go ahead and deny documents because nothing happened and no one challenged them. Right. You know, this is set a bad standard in our democratic societies.
Yeah. I think we're in a very difficult position where if we do our jobs, if you do your job well as a reporter today, you're getting spied on. And they only, and so they're trying to force us to act like spies. And that's a really big change in the way reporters have to do their jobs.
So thank you, and we have to close the session. Thanks to you. hope you enjoyed the panel.